It's a new watch day. It's a new watch day. Guess what? We have a bunch of new watches. Hey guys, it is Nathan with Crown and Caliber, and if I was excited a couple of weeks ago because we had a new Submariner, then I am even that much more excited today. So, a couple of weeks ago, we received the 124060 no-date sub, and I was giddy like a little schoolboy. I mean, we did a reveal on camera, and the fact that we had a 41mm sub just made me super excited. Took lots of measurements, was just geeking out over the watch. And then just days, if not weeks later, we get the 126610 LV, the new green bezel, and the 126610 LN black bezel date sub. And so to kind of reprise the previous video, based on comments that we had in the first one, we went ahead and got the past 3 generations of all those. So here we go, the no date in progression, the date sub in progression, and the 3 anniversary subs in progression. And this is such a privilege of being able to work here at Crown and Caliber that I get to see all of these watches and hold them and examine them and take an inordinate number of measurements and really start to come up with the differences and kind of create a definitive guide on the current Submariner. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through these watches and look at kind of the bigger picture, because I've already taken all the measurements and this time around we won't focus on that, but we're going to focus on the differences that have occurred and then also how they wear and ultimately what I think is the best sub now. So let's jump in. Okay, so getting started. I'm gonna take a breath. Whew.
Yeah, slow down.
Whew. I'm nervous, I'm excited. Okay, so jumping in. We will get Jonathan to take photos of these watches on my wrist. We'll get some close-ups on my wrist as well, so you get an idea of how they wear. But we're gonna jump right in and talk about first the 5-digit references. So that is the no date Submariner right here, the 5-digit date sub right here, and the 5-digit anniversary Submariner right here. So 14060, 16610, and 16610 LV for the green bezel, known as the Kermit. These 3 represent kind of the end of the line as far as what the sub had looked like for effectively 50 years. And I think what's really interesting between these 3 is there's a lot of inconsistencies. They're not the same thickness. The size, which we're measuring from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock, corroborated with 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock on the outside of the bezel. They are also not consistent. The lug to lug is not consistent. There just is inconsistencies in the size, which means that in production, there's just differences. They're great watches. I mean, it's a Submariner. You have, all 3 of them have hollow center links in the bracelet, but in the 2 date subs, the end links are solid end links. So it made for a much more secure fit. Specifically here, we're looking at transitional references, which means the case sides no longer have pierced lugs. The no date sub never received the solid end links and the closed off case sides as a 5-digit reference. So just some context and kind of what that watch is. So these are the 6-digit references. These were the super case references, the ceramic sub as it's come to be known, and things got more consistent. The watches had the same thickness. They had the same size dial, same size case, same size bezel. They now had the updated bracelet, which meant not only did the no date sub now have the solid end links, all of the center links were now solid as well, and it had the updated milled clasp with the new divisor extension, kind of easy link. So in every way, I think the 6-digit super case ceramic sub, as we're gonna call it, was more impressive. I've said that before, that's nothing new. Some of the flaws, I'm gonna call them what they are, call them flaws with the watch, is the super case. It is a much more blocky design. At the end of the lugs, it is just chunky, which then makes that transition to the bracelet much less elegant than its 5-digit predecessor. This is gonna get really granular, but it was a good thing and a bad thing. When we switched to the 6-digit reference, the bracelet on the 6 o'clock side has 1 less non-removable link. What that means is on the 6-digit reference bracelet on the 6 o'clock side, there are 3 non-removable links, which then means you can size the watch much smaller and you can have the clasp centered in your wrist. So for people that have, let's say it probably starts around a 6.5-inch wrist, you could much more easily center the clasp, which is a good thing. But what then had to happen is that means that the bracelet had to now taper from 20 millimeters at the lug to 16 millimeters, because that is the size of the removable links. And it had to do that in 1 less link. So it had to do it in 3 links. And if you look on the Supercase Submariners, the bracelet taper is really aggressive. And it almost makes it seem like the heft of the Submariner is gonna overtake that of the bracelet. And pairing that with these much more blocky lugs makes for some pretty extreme angles. This is a perfect time to mention that we are talking on an extremely granular level. But that's what Rolex is. That's how Rolex operates, and that's a lot of why people love these watches. And it's somewhat lost on this design because when it works, you don't really notice it. But when it doesn't work, it's noticeable. And I think what we see here across these generations is if you just glance, you're looking at the same watch, but it's these minor changes over time and a refinement of a design that makes it so great. So that's a short offshoot, but back on track here. We ended up with a bracelet that could more easily be sized for smaller wrists, but with that, a much more aggressive taper from the 20 millimeter to the 16 millimeter removable link. Okay, moving on. We are now to the 2020 Submariner, the 124060 and the 126610, of course, the LV and the LN, green and black bezel. And with this release, which just dropped in September, it seems that Rolex may have righted its wrongs. So let's start with the positives. Then I think going forward, I'm gonna call these the 12s because it's a 1-2 reference and I don't know what we're gonna continue calling them. So the 12s, they continued the consistency. So they had the same size diameter, all 3 of them do, which we would expect between the black and the green bezel dated subs. They're gonna be the same. Lug to lug is the same, thickness is the same, bezel is the same. So again, consistency is there. Now, here's where things start to get really interesting in my opinion. We'll start with maybe the most obvious, is the case size increased. So it went to the 41 millimeter sub, but as we addressed a few weeks ago, it's not really a 41 millimeter. The previous generation, the 6-digit Supercase, was a 40.2 millimeter watch, and in the new 12s, we have a 40.5 millimeter case size. So we are talking 0.3 of a millimeter in difference, so not a full 41 millimeter. Consistently across the board, it is a 40.5 millimeter case. The bracelet went from a 20 millimeter to a 21 millimeter bracelet, so making for a larger bracelet. And also the dial on these 3 went from a 30 millimeter to a 30.3 millimeter. So what we can see is proportionally the case size and the dial grew in unison from the 6-digit reference. Now, some of the more nuanced things. What that means is that the bezel, which how we measured the bezel here is we measured from the case diameter. So that's from the outside of the bezel. We measured from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock and then corroborated it from 6 to 12 for consistency. And then for dial, we measured the crystal. And again, 3 to 9 o'clock, 6 to 12 for consistency. And we took the difference as the bezel measurement. Here's what's crazy. From the 5-digit reference all the way to the new 12s, the 2020 Submariner, the bezel has remained the same. It is a 5.1 millimeter bezel, which means on the newest sub, it has, proportionally speaking, a thinner bezel. And is that going to be that noticeable? No. It is, again, fractions of a millimeter, but it does have a proportionally thinner bezel, which I think is a pretty crazy point. A couple other points. Now that we have a thicker bracelet in a 21 millimeter on the new reference, and the outside measurement of the lugs on the newer Submariners is actually thinner, millimeter from the previous Supercase, we end up with both visually thinner, but actually thinner lugs. So, you know, there's probably some margin for error in how I measured things. I tried to be extremely consistent, but effectively each lug is a millimeter thinner at its end than the previous generation. So you have a slightly larger case size, you have physically thinner lugs, and with that bigger bracelet, it just makes it seem that much more elegant because it is proportionally that much thinner in comparison to its previous generation. Other things worth noting of importance is the new generation is actually thinner. The previous generation sub, the Supercase, was 12.3 millimeters thick, we're now looking at a watch that is 12 millimeters thick. And again, 0.3 of a millimeter, how big of a difference is that, Nathan? Well, it's a pretty big difference when you're starting to talk about case thickness. And the fact that the watch has gotten bigger, diameter-wise, marginal it may be, and thinner means it is going to wear that much better on the wrist. Paired with the fact that the taper is also smaller, it just wears smaller. There, I said it. The new 41 millimeter Submariner actually wears smaller than its previous generation. Another point, and this is, I think, really granular, but it is worth mentioning. So the new reference is a 21 millimeter bracelet. It now tapers to a 17 millimeter removable link. And with that, it is still done over 3 removable links in the bracelet. And funny enough, millimeter for millimeter, the taper seems to be the same. So you're going from 21 to effectively a 17 millimeter link. Over those 3 links that are non-removable, the taper is the same measurement. But because in the new reference, it is a larger bracelet, that means that millimeter for millimeter is proportionally a smaller percentage. And thus on the new reference, the bracelet taper does not seem as aggressive. And like I said, this is granular. These measurements are minor, but when you see the sum of the parts and you see it together, it looks so much better. Another interesting point is, we'll go back all the way to the 5-digit. So I mentioned that 6 o'clock side, 4 non-removable links, and that happened to be on both sides of the case. Jump up to the 6-digit reference, we have now 3 non-removable links, which means you can size the watch even smaller and have a centered clasp on the underside of your wrist. We jump to the newest reference, you have 3 non-removable links on the 6 o'clock side, but now 4 non-removable links on the 12 o'clock side. Why Rolex did this? We can speculate. Here are a few things. How the clasp sits means that you are generally going to want a smaller bracelet size on the 6 o'clock side. So there's no real reason to have equal non-removable links on both sides. That would seem to be probably the most obvious reason. But I think an interesting point to that is now there has to be a separate product number, a separate SKU for the 6 o'clock and the 12 o'clock bracelet side. Because it's non-removable, you have 2 physically different parts. And I think that is maybe small, but on the scale in which Rolex makes watches is pretty impressive. And these are the things that I think can get missed if you own one and don't have the opportunity to look at 9 of them. But that is small changes that really speak to Rolex saying, hey, we are going to in every way refine this and make it the best that we can make it. And something as silly and trivial as that may seem, that makes a big difference. And it really goes to show that nothing is without consideration in this watch. Something a lot of people also asked about is the weight of the subs. So going from the 5-digit reference to the 6-digit reference, you're looking at a difference of about 30 grams. May not sound like a lot, but when it is on your wrist, it is noticeable. I think with going from the 40 millimeter to the 41, there was a concern that it was going to get that much heavier. Well, I'll let you know that the 3 41 millimeter Submariners are like 2 to 3 grams heavier. I mean, it is a negligible difference. I had talked with one of the watchmakers and he said that the new 3200 series movement is actually a heavier movement. So it probably has some of the weight difference as well. But all in all, the weight difference between the 6-digit Supercase and the new Submariners is negligible. And so if you are used to the weight of one of the heavier watches, which I will say is mainly from the bracelet, the fact that all those center links are now solid milled stainless steel, that is where it's gaining a lot of weight. So if you're used to that, the new 41 millimeter reference isn't going to change that much. And for those of you that love the 5-digit reference, the lighter weight of that, I think with the updated clasp design and bracelet, you can, especially if you have a smaller wrist, more finally dial in where that clasp sits and probably get a better fit on your wrist. So I don't think the weight difference really even applies now to the newer reference because of how you can get that clasp to sit that much better and that much more accurately on your wrist. So point worth addressing is the weight because they are heavier, but I think it's a negligible difference when it comes to the updated bracelet as well. All right, now that we've covered a ton of numbers, I do want to briefly address the movement. So in the 5-digit references, we had the 3100 series, the 3130 in the no date, the 3135, and the 2 dated versions. Jumping to the Supercase, that didn't change. So the 114060 no date continued having the 3130, and the Hulk and the Supercase date sub had the 3135. So when we jumped into the 12s, we gained the wholly new 3200 series movement. So it'd be the 3230 and the 3235 in the date versions. And Rolex says something like 95% new parts. things like their chrono energy escapement, which is a much more efficient escapement, things like a 70-hour power reserve. So definitely performance-wise, a much superior movement. One of the points of contention potentially in the 3200 series is the oscillating weight. Apparently there are new bearings in the pivot, and people say that it is louder. So we're going to do our best to capture that with the microphones on a comparison between the 3100 series movement and the 3200 series movement, and really see if there is a noticeable difference because of those bearings. But other than that, the movement is by far a superior movement. So we have a lot of numbers and movement stuff out of the way, so let's talk visually speaking. And I want to start with the 126610 LV Starbucks Cermet, whatever we're going to call it. We'll come up with a name for it. The green bezel seems to be the same green bezel that came from the Hulk. Now it has a black dial rather than the green sunburst dial from the Hulk, so it looks more like the Kermit. I'm still on the fence about this. I was a big lover of the Hulk. I loved the green dial. I loved how it appeared black in some lights, but the Super Case just didn't do it for me. So I was super excited when they released this watch. But I kind of wish, because it's back to the black dial, that the green was a little bit more of that emerald green that the Kermit had. So I'm still on the fence about what I think visually about this watch. But again, stylistically, I think the sub is definitely a step in the right direction, like we've talked about. Now, between the plain date version and the 124060, I mean, these two watches, I'll just say it, are near perfect. I mean, the proportions are great. Like I said, they wear super well. The black is wonderful. The font on all three of these now is a little bit more bold. And I think in the side-by-sides, you'll notice that. All three of these watches also, the hands have grown, not only because the case size grew, but proportionally. The minute hand now comes all the way to the minute track. The second hand is also a little longer. So the hands just fill the dial that much better. Another point, this is going to be kind of hard to notice, but is at the center post, it does seem that it dips in a little more than the previous Super Case reference, and you can kind of catch it in some of the reflections from the high gloss lacquer on the dial. Someone did mention that in the previous video, and I didn't notice it at first, and as I looked harder and harder, I think it is there. I think there is a noticeable dip that wasn't in the previous reference. So now that we've talked about a bunch of measurements on the watch, let's kind of step back again. Rolex is never going to say this, but the Super Case was a mistake. Some people may like it, but if we go from the 5-digit reference to the new 12s, as I'm calling them, it seems like a natural succession. It seems like the Super Case was kind of an offshoot, and they have fixed it. In every way, the new 12s seem like the older brother, the newer sibling, the bigger brother, whatever you want to call it, to the old 5-digit reference. The elegant lines are back, albeit they're a little bit bigger, a little bit more impressive, words that I use to describe the Super Case, but they don't come with this blocky, aggressive design that the Super Case had. And in every way, the 12 retains that impressive nature that the Super Case had, but it brings back the elegance of the 5-digit reference. So I'm a big proponent of the 5-digit Submariners. I love the nostalgia that it, at a glance, looks like a sub that's 30 or 40 years old, and you can't really tell the difference. But the impressive nature of the Super Case sub, the ceramic sub, and now the 12s is hard to deny. And especially with the 12, it feels truly, and I've said this before, but it feels like a modern sports watch. It is impressive. Its proportions are great. It wears so well. So I think that it goes without saying that the three new 12s, the 124060, the 126610, and the 126610 LV, ceramic, Kermit, Starbucks, whatever we're gonna call it, are the definitive Submariner. If you are looking for a Submariner, well, good luck, you're probably not gonna find one, but if you are shopping for a Submariner, those are what I'm going to recommend. They proportionally are as perfect as we've seen yet, and I think that from the sheer technology standpoint, they are extremely impressive. So line in the sand, that's what I'm saying. I am saying that the new references are kind of the definitive go-tos. Maybe that'll change in the coming months as I've seen more of these and the newness wears off. But I think the fact that I am able to empirically look at them, I'm able to make a pretty objective decision in what I think is the current best sub offering. The new Submariner, we got them all. If you have questions, please continue to put them in the comments. We have the watches, we will answer them and let you know anything you want to know about them. And as always, thanks for watching.